welding table costs $2,100. That is not my opinion. That is GSA schedule pricing, Miller Electric factory invoice, and 8 years of my own procurement matrices out of Norfolk. My employer was charging the United States Navy $15,000 for each one. 340 tables. 48 welders who had never been certified laid hull section beads on those tables for 3 submarine programs. My son serves on one of those programs. I counted the invoices 41 times. The number did not move. Let me tell you how a man reassigned to a mezzanine desk above a sandblasting booth brought down a $200 million defense subcontractor with a manila envelope full of uncashed checks and a shelf of NAVSEA technical publications his mother bought him as a retirement gift. My name is Randy Stanton. I am 58 years old. I spent 22 years in the United States Navy as a machinist's mate, and I retired as a senior chief after a last tour at Norfolk Naval Shipyard with fleet maintenance activity. I married a woman named Marilyn in 1992 in a chapel on Little Creek Base. We divorced in 2014 on a Tuesday morning in a small family court building in Virginia Beach, and we did not fight about anything because there was not much to fight about. We have one son. His name is Eli. He is 26 years old. He is a petty officer second class on the USS Pasadena, which is a Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine, hull SSN 752. He follows what his grandfather did and what I did, and he does it better than either of us because he listens harder. That is what I have in the world. One son. One house in Summerville, South Carolina, which I inherited from my mother when she died of pancreatic cancer in 2022. One 1996 ranch on a half-acre, a truck, a set of books. I took the job at the Goose Creek site in March of 2025. The company was a regional defense manufacturer with prime contracts on submarine hull section fabrication for Electric Boat and on aerospace structural panels for General Dynamics NASSCO. They had about 310 people on the Goose Creek floor, spread across 2 welding bays, a sandblasting booth, a machining line, and a quality section with its own office tree. The man who owned the company was named Edward Wexler. He went by Ed. He was 61 years old. He was a second-generation owner. His father had started the company in 1971 doing subcontract work for the Charleston Naval Shipyard, and when the shipyard closed in the 90s, the father converted to the electric boat supply chain. The father had been in the Navy during Vietnam. Ed had not. Ed had spent his 20s selling industrial real estate in Atlanta, and he came home in 1989 when the father got sick. He had run the company since 1992. He was, by every outward measure, a good low-country businessman. He sponsored the high school football team. He spoke at the Somerville Chamber of Commerce. He had a wall of Navy caps in his office that visitors were expected to admire, each one labeled with the ship and the year, and a framed photograph of his father in dress whites that was positioned so that the father could appear to be watching the meetings. Ed recruited me himself. He flew to Norfolk. He met me at a steakhouse near the base. He told me the company was growing. He told me the electric boat rate book was climbing. He told me he needed what he called a real Navy man to run his operations because he did not trust consulting firms and because his current chief operating officer, a retired civilian contract manager, was retiring at the end of the quarter. He told me he wanted to do the work right. He told me his father had always said that if a man welded a hull for the Navy, he welded a piece of his own country. Ed was good at speeches. I believed him at the time. I took the offer. $42,000 signing bonus, a performance incentive structure quarterly, health insurance that bridged my Navy plan into the 30-year civilian continuation threshold I was 11 months away from, a house that I could keep, a son whose boat home-ported in Charleston on his rotations, and in Norfolk between them. I accepted the job on a Thursday. I moved my shop tools down to Somerville on a Saturday. I started on a Monday. I am not the kind of man who falls for a speech. That is worth saying before I tell the rest of this. I am not the kind of man who believes that people can be measured by how much they respect my service. I have met plenty of men who talked about respecting the Navy and who did not know what the inside of a hull looked like. I have met plenty of men who never said a word about the Navy and who would have stood watch with me in a typhoon. What I did believe, coming into that job, was that a defense subcontractor with prime contracts on hull section fabrication for live submarine programs would be subject to enough oversight to make the work honest, and that a man running such a company would have learned to work inside that oversight, even if his instincts were not particularly honest. I was wrong about the second part. I was half right about the first. The oversight was there. It was just thin, and a man who knew where the thin places were could drive a truck through them for 20 years and nobody would notice, because the men who would have noticed had been reassigned to other accounts, or sent to Afghanistan, or retired, or moved on to software firms in Virginia with better pay. The first week on the Goose Creek floor, I walked the bays with the plant manager, a man named Ruel Thigpen, who had worked for the father and then for Ed, and who had a cough he had not been able to shake since winter. He was a decent man. He was 63. He had a son at Charleston Southern. He gave me a good orientation. He showed me the welding tables in Bay 2. They were Miller Arc Station 40 units, which I had bought through GSA Schedule 77 in Norfolk for $2,108 apiece. Good tables, heavy-duty, standard industrial equipment. I walked along the bay and counted them out of habit. I counted 86 tables in Bay 2. Ruel coughed and said there were more in Bay 3 and in the fabrication line on the upper deck. By the end of my first week, I estimated the total tables in active use across the site at around 340. I remember I wrote the number in a small notebook I keep in my truck. I wrote it because I wanted to remember it for the equipment depreciation reviews. I did not write it because I suspected anything. I suspected nothing at that point. I was a new hire trying to learn a floor. On the second Tuesday, which was the 8th of April in 2025, I was sitting with Dallas McKean, the procurement specialist, going through the capital equipment inventory on an old Dell with a cracked corner. Dallas was 29. She was a single mother of a 4-year-old boy named Sutton. Her husband had left her in 2023. She had been with the company 4 years. She was good at her job. She pulled up the active purchase history on the welding tables so I could see the vendors and the lead times for spare parts. The tables were listed as capital equipment line items against specific Navy contract numbers, and the unit pricing was displayed per asset. The pricing field for the Miller Arc Station 40 unit read $15,000. I stopped reading. I asked her to pull the original purchase order. The purchase order matched, $15,000 per unit. I did not say anything to Dallas. I asked her to pull 10 other recent PO lines for welding equipment. She did. They were all priced in the same band. Ground clamps at $300 each that sell for $22. Ventilation hoods at $6,000 that sell for $900. Flux cord wire at $40 a pound that sells for $4. Every line was multiplied by a factor between 4 and 7 times what the actual open market price would be. I told Dallas it was probably a data entry issue and that I would look into it with the CFO. I went back to the temporary office Ed had given me, which was a small glass-walled room behind the front lobby, and I sat down and I did not move for 40 minutes. I had seen this kind of pattern before. I had seen it on the outside of the Navy fence during contract audits in Norfolk, when small firms got caught for a quarter and fined and quietly phased out of the rate book. I had never seen it inside a firm I was actually working at. I had certainly never seen it at this scale. 340 tables times almost $13,000 of overcharge per table is $4.4 million on a single line item. And if every line item in the capital equipment stack was pricing at 4 to 7 times actual, then the number across the company was not small. It was the reason the company existed in its current form. The Navy and the Air Force were not customers. They were the yield. That night, I drove back to Somerville through the marsh and thought about what my father used to say about the shop floor at Flint Buick, which was that a man who steals from his tools steals from the man who swings the hammer. My father was a tool and die maker at General Motors for 31 years. He was a Korean War veteran, infantry, 1st Marine Division, not Navy, but he thought in terms of the shop. He died in 2009 of congestive heart failure in a hospital room in Flint, and my mother and I were with him, and the last conversation I had with him was about the tariffs on Chinese steel that year and about how the numbers on the shop floor always told the truth if you knew which numbers to read. He died on a Wednesday. 20 years later, driving through a low-country marsh at 7:30 at night, I was trying to figure out which numbers on this shop floor I was willing to read. I got home. I ate a sandwich standing at the counter. I did not sleep well. The following Monday, I asked Claudette Seyfried, the Human Resources Director, to pull the training and certification records for the welding floor. Claudette was 47 years old. She had been with Ed for 15 years. She gave me a slightly puzzled look and said the certification records for the welders were actually managed on the quality assurance side under Gil Kresge. I asked Claudette how many welders worked across the 2 bays plus the whole section line. She said 48. I thanked her. I walked over to the quality office, which was in a separate trailer attached to Bay 1, and I asked Gil Kresge for the certification binder. Gil Kresge was 54. He was Ed's brother-in-law. He had married Ed's younger sister Carla in 1996. He had no technical credentials when Ed hired him in 2004 as quality director. He had earned an American Welding Society Certified Welding Inspector designation through a weekend course in 2009. He wore a Navy cap every day, even though he had not served. He called me sir from the first day, which I did not like, and which I took, rightly, as a sign that he resented the word. He brought me a 3-ring binder with a typed spreadsheet inside it. The binder was titled Welder Qualifications, Active Roster. 48 welder names, 48 lines. Each line had a code for a welding process, a code for a steel grade, a date of qualification, and a signature. The signature on every line was G. Kresge, Plant QA. I thanked him. I asked for the supporting third-party documentation. The NAVSE 250-1500-1 test coupons. The American Welding Society D1.1 performance qualifications. The independent laboratory reports. Gil looked at me and said those were archived off-site. I asked where. He said he would check and get back to me. He did not get back to me. I did not press him that day. I do not want to overstate my own calmness about this. I was angry. I was angry because I had spent 22 years in the engine rooms and on the piers of submarines that got their hull sections from men like Gil Kresge. And I was angry because I had signed every one of my qualifications in a test cell under the eye of an instructor who would tear up the form in front of me if my bead was off by a 1/16 of an inch. And I was angry because the plaque on the wall of the conference room said, "Integrity at every weld," and because my son was walking the pressure hull of a Los Angeles-class boat every night in a rack 7 inches from the inside skin of that hull. I was angry. I drove home that Friday on a long stretch of highway through the pines, and I sat in the truck in the driveway for a while before I went inside, because I did not want to take the anger into my mother's kitchen. I went inside, I put the notebook on the table, and I wrote out the number 48. 48 welders, no third-party qualifications, 1 signature on every line. That was the number my son slept on every night underwater. That weekend, I drove back up to Norfolk to pick up the rest of the NAVSE technical publications from a storage unit my mother had rented before she died. I had told her I did not need them. She had bought them anyway at a government surplus auction in 2016. She had said to me, "Randy, you are going to need these." She had been right. I drove them down in the bed of the truck under a tarp. I set them up on the bookshelf in the second bedroom of the Somerville house. 342 manuals. NAVSE 0900-LP-001 through 15. NAVSEA 250-1500-1. The Submarine Weld Specification. The Commercial Submarine Structural Welding Standard. The Ship Repair Welding Standard. I opened the first one that Sunday night, and I sat with it for 4 hours. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted to find something in those pages that allowed what was happening at Goose Creek. I did not find it. The specifications are written for a reason. The reason is that a weld on a submarine hull is what stands between a sailor and a column of water. There is no part of the specification that allows a 7 times overcharge. There is no part of the specification that allows an in-house signature on a qualification line. These are the rules. These are the rules because the rules are what the people in the uniforms are. I closed the book at 2 in the morning and I did not put the pages back. I want to be clear about one thing. I did not go to Ed yet. I did not go to Ed because I already knew what Ed would say. I had heard the speech. I had heard the speech when he recruited me. I had watched his eyes while he gave it. I knew the difference between a man who believed what he was saying and a man who had learned what he was supposed to say. I did not need a second speech from Ed. What I needed was a pattern. What I needed was evidence. I started building it on my own time for the next 6 weeks. I went into work every morning at 5:30. I walked the bays with a notebook. I copied job tickets into that notebook. I copied serial numbers off the tables. I copied welder badge numbers off the floor logs. I watched the day shift come in and go to the welding bays. I watched the quality inspectors from Gill's trailer come out with their clipboards. I noticed after 2 weeks that one of the quality inspectors, a young man named Orrin Halsey, was copying entries off a paper checklist onto the NAVSEA OQE packets before the welds had even been started. I noticed that the checklist he was copying from was a pre-printed form with the blanks already filled in. I noticed that the blanks were filled in the same handwriting across every inspector's packet. I recognized the handwriting. It was Gil Kresge's. At night, I sat at my mother's kitchen table with the laptop and the 3-ring binders and the NAVSEA publications, and I cross-referenced every line I could cross-reference. I built a spreadsheet that listed the capital equipment charges to Navy and Air Force contracts by vendor, by model number, by asset tag, and by date. I pulled the Miller Electric Factory Invoice Archive, the Lincoln Electric Factory Invoice Archive, the GSA Schedule 77 Rate Book from 2019 through 2024, and the Defense Logistics Agency Historical Unit Pricing from the Public Procurement Portal. I assembled the comparison matrix. I called it the pricing matrix. It was not fancy. It was an Excel file. It ran to 7 tabs. It held 340 line items for the welding tables alone, and another 912 line items for ground clamps, welding hoods, flux cord wire, electrode holders, submerged arc units, and the rest of the consumables that fed the floor. The aggregate overcharge across active Navy and Air Force contracts, measured conservatively and allowing for a 10% legitimate regional markup, came out to $17.1 million over a 32-month window. The training and certification side was simpler. There was no legitimate file defined because the legitimate file did not exist. I pulled the American Welding Society registry on every single welder name Claudette had given me. 48 names. 22 had never held an AWS qualification in their lives. 19 had expired AWS qualifications that had lapsed more than 3 years ago. 7 had active AWS qualifications that were for processes and thicknesses that did not match the work they were actually doing on the floor. 0 had the NAVSEA 250-1500-1 qualification that is required for submarine hull section welding. I pulled the Department of Labor grant drawdown for the company's workforce development program, which had been approved in 2023 as a registered apprenticeship program, providing welder training to economically distressed counties. The drawdown over the active grant period was $1.94 million. The drawdown reports, which Claudette had filed quarterly, listed 48 apprentice welders enrolled in the program. The American Welding Society had no record of any of those 48 welders ever sitting for a certification test under the program. The workforce development money had been drawn down for 18 months on a ghost training roster. On the 22nd of May, I set up a meeting with Ed. I did not tell him what it was about. I walked into his office at 4 in the afternoon with 2 manila folders. I sat in the leather chair he keeps for visitors. I opened the first folder and laid out the pricing matrix summary sheet, which showed the aggregate overcharge across Navy and Air Force contracts. I opened the second folder and laid out the certification comparison sheet. I said to him, "Ed, we would not be able to defend this at a NAVSEA audit. The tables are priced at 7 times the GSA rate. The welders have no third-party certifications. The Department of Labor grant has been drawn down against a ghost roster. You need to stop charging and re-qualify your welding floor before the next contract modification. I said it quietly. I said it the way I would have said it to a junior officer who had made an honest mistake. Ed looked at the papers. He did not pick them up. He smiled at me. He leaned back in his chair. He said, "Randy, you have been in uniform. You think Washington checks. They do not. They do not have the manpower. This is how business gets done out here. The government pays what it pays. We build what we build. Everybody goes home." I said, "Ed, some of the ships going home have my son on them." He said, "Randy, your son is not going to go through any hull that fails because of anything we do here." I said, "Ed, you cannot know that." He said, "I can know that because I know my product." I thanked him for his time. I gathered the papers. I put them back in the folders. I walked out. I drove home. I did not eat that night. I sat on the back porch in the dark. That was a Thursday. The following Monday, the 26th of May, at 6:47 in the morning, I was asked to come to the conference room for what the calendar invitation had called an operational realignment meeting. Ed was there. The Vice President of Human Resources, a woman named Lex Harmony, was there. The Chief Financial Officer, Blake Wexler, who is Ed's son, was there. Ed slid a piece of paper across the formica. The paper was a memorandum reassigning me from Chief Operating Officer to a newly created position called Director of Veterans Outreach and Legacy Programs. The role reported to Ed directly. It had no direct reports. It had no budget authority. It had no presence on the capital expenditure approval tree. The desk assigned to the role was on the Bay 13 mezzanine, above the sandblasting booth, on a steel grate catwalk. Ed smiled. He said, "Randy, we need a uniform in that role. You are the uniform." Lex slid over the revised org chart. My name was in a box with a dotted line going nowhere. The plaque on the wall said, "Integrity at every weld." Blake did not look at me. Ed waited for a response. I said, "Yes, sir." I signed the memo. I stood up. I walked out of the conference room. I walked through the lobby. I walked out to the parking lot. I sat in the truck for 22 minutes with the engine off. Then I drove home. I went into my mother's house. I took the 3-ring binder off the bookshelf. I sat down at the kitchen table. I started pulling files. I want to explain what a mezzanine desk above a sandblasting booth actually means. The booth operates 6 hours a day. The noise level inside the booth is 104 decibels. The noise level on the catwalk above the booth is 91 decibels continuous. The desk they gave me was a laminate office desk, the kind that sold for $89 at Office Depot in the 1990s. The chair was a stacking chair. The overhead lighting was one fluorescent tube. The quote-unquote legacy programs team consisted of 3 people from marketing, none of whom had served, all of whom had been told by Lex that they now reported to me for veteran outreach purposes. They came up to the mezzanine once on the first day to shake my hand and introduce themselves, and then they did not come up again. They did not know what to say to me. I did not know what to say to them. That is the point. That is the design. The reassignment was not a role. It was a humiliation position. It was the kind of position that a man in his 50s, with 11 months to go on his healthcare continuation, is supposed to accept quietly and write out the calendar on. I did not write it out. I worked from that mezzanine for the next 7 weeks. I walked the welding bays every morning. I watched the tables. I counted the welders. I photographed the certification signatures on the quality room wall. I built out the pricing matrix to 466 line items. I kept the notebooks in the truck. I carried the laptop home every night. I did not use the company VPN. I did not use the company email for anything I cared about. I went to work. I said good morning. I said good evening. I wrote the Veterans Outreach newsletter that Lex wanted me to write. I did what Lex called community engagement. I did not escalate anything inside the building. I was not trying to win the building. The building was not going to be won. What I was trying to do, and what I was doing, was 2 things at once. I was trying to find the 2 or 3 other people inside the building who had seen what I had seen and who had decided that what they had seen was wrong. I found them one at a time. The first was Lloyd Enderly. Lloyd was 54. He was a security guard on the night shift, 4 to midnight shift, and midnight to 8. He was a Marine Corps veteran, Gulf War era, 2 tours, one at Camp Lejeune and one at 29 Palms. He had a medical discharge in 1994 for a lower back injury, and he had worked security jobs in the Charleston area ever since. He had been at the Goose Creek site for 11 years. He knew everybody. He started talking to me in the parking lot at 5:30 in the morning when I came in, because I was coming in early enough that the night shift was still there. He was smoking a cigarette he was not supposed to be smoking. He said, "Chief, you ever look at what happens here on Friday nights?" I said, "No, Lloyd, I have not." He said, "You should look." I said, "Tell me what to look for." He said, "On Friday nights, starting about 10 o'clock, 2 men come in a Ford F-250 with Alabama plates. They sign in at the gate under the name Gulf Coast Arc Services. They work in Bay 1 until about 4 in the morning. They grind down the welds from the day shift. They weld them over. Gil comes in at midnight to check them. Gil pays them in cash out of an envelope. He does not sign anything. He does not file anything." I said, "Lloyd, have you seen the envelope?" He said, "Yes, Chief." I said, "How much?" He said, "I never counted, but it is thick." I said, "Would you be willing to tell someone about this?" He said, "I would be willing to tell the right someone." I did not push him further that morning. I did not have the right someone yet. I just thanked him. I wrote his name down. I wrote the license plate number of the Ford F-250 down. I wrote the names of the Alabama welders down, which Lloyd had gotten off the sign-in sheet. Their names were Vernell Broadus and Gerald Okonkwo. The second was Dallas McKean. Dallas wrote me an email on my personal Gmail account on the 17th of June. The subject line was just the word, Randy. The body of the email was 2 sentences. She said, "I saved the export. It is big. Can we meet off-site?" I drove up to a subway parking lot in Monk's Corner, which is about 20 minutes north of Goose Creek. I sat in the truck with the windows down because it was 87 degrees at 7:20 in the evening. Dallas pulled up in a red 2016 Hyundai Elantra. She got out. She walked over to my truck. She gave me a USB drive through the window. She said, "Randy, I am sorry." I said, "For what?" She said, "I knew. Everyone knew. Nobody said anything." I said, "Dallas, you are saying something now. That matters." She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I am going to do the right thing with it." She said, "Will my name be on anything?" I said, "I am going to talk to a lawyer before I answer that." She said, "Okay, Randy." She got back in the Hyundai. She drove away. I drove home with the USB drive in the cup holder. I did not look at it that night. I did not want to be the kind of man who could not wait. The next morning, I looked. The USB drive held 340 capital equipment invoices, scanned and organized by Navy contract number. It held the full quarterly drawdown reports for the Department of Labor grant back to the grant's approval in 2023. It held 6 internal emails from Blake Wexler to Dallas between February and April of 2025. The emails told Dallas to match the nomenclature on the vendor invoice to the NSN line item on the Navy PO, regardless of whether the vendor invoice actually matched the NSN line item. Quote, "Just match the nomenclature to the NSN line," close quote. One of the emails included a CC to Gil Kresge. One of the emails included a CC to Ed. This was not plausible deniability by Ed anymore. This was Ed on an email thread. I put the USB drive in a small, fireproof safe I keep in the second bedroom of the Somerville house. I made a copy onto a second USB drive. I put the second USB drive in the glove compartment of the truck. I made a third copy onto an external hard drive. I put the external hard drive in a lockbox under my bed. These were my standard operating procedures from 22 years of keeping maintenance records for submarines. 3 copies, 3 locations, One master inventory list I kept in my head. I did not need the spreadsheet for it. In the last week of June, I drove to Charleston and I met with an attorney named Marissa Ogburn. Marissa was 41 years old. She was a former trial attorney with the Department of Justice Civil Fraud Section. She had left in 2019 and had opened a solo practice in Charleston, specializing in key TAM relator representation under the False Claims Act, 31 United States Code Section 3729 through 3733. She had been a lead attorney on two of the largest defense contractor settlements of the last decade. She was recommended to me by a retired Navy Judge Advocate General officer I had served with in Norfolk, a man named Commander Oswin Leverett, retired, who was now teaching at Charleston School of Law. I drove to Marissa's office. I sat in a chair across from her desk. I told her the story for 2 hours. I did not edit. I did not soften. She took notes. She did not interrupt. When I was finished, she asked me a series of questions about the evidence. I answered them. She asked me if I understood that filing under seal would mean I could not tell anyone, including my son, for as long as the case was sealed, which she said could be 18 months to 3 years or longer. I said I understood. She asked me if I was prepared for the possibility that the government would decline to intervene, in which case I would have to choose whether to proceed alone, which was a much harder path. I said I was prepared. She asked me if I wanted a week to think about it. I said yes. I took the week. I drove home. I ate dinner standing at the counter. I did not talk to my son. I did not talk to anyone. At the end of the week, I called her back. I said, "Marissa, let us file." She said, "Randy, we will file next Thursday." On the 17th of July, in the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina, Charleston Division, Marissa Ogburn filed a complaint under seal on my behalf, naming the company, naming Edward Wexler as principal, naming Blake Wexler, naming Gilbert Kresge, and naming the Alabama Shell LLC Gulf Coast Arc Services as co-defendants, alleging violations of the False Claims Act, and attaching 71 exhibits drawn from the USB drive Dallas had given me, from my pricing matrix, from my notebooks, from the personnel file photographs, and from the Quality Assurance Signature Archive. I signed the relator certification. I went home. I went to work the next Monday. I did what Lex wanted me to do. I wrote the Veterans Outreach newsletter. I attended the Chamber of Commerce breakfast. I did not raise anything inside the building ever again. I continued to walk the bays. I continued to document. I continued to send supplemental declarations to Marissa quarterly. 2 months passed. Nothing happened. 4 months passed. Nothing happened. 6 months passed. Nothing happened. I want to try to describe what it is like to live inside a sealed federal case for 1.25 years. I do not think I can do it perfectly. I can say that it is not dramatic. It is not tense. It is not a thriller. It is mostly waiting. It is going to work every morning at 5:30 and coming home every night at 6:30 and eating whatever is in the refrigerator and watching 2 innings of whatever Braves game is on and going to bed at 10. It is church on Sunday mornings at a small Episcopal parish on Main Street in Somerville, where nobody knows anything about what I am doing. It is my son's occasional phone calls from whatever port the Pasadena is in at that moment. It is Eli saying, "Dad, how is the new job going?" And me saying, "It is going fine, son. How are you?" And him saying, "Good." It is my son not knowing that at that moment, the case is sealed on a federal docket 80 miles from where his father lives, and that the docket carries his own hull number on it because the hull number is inside a footnote describing the affected procurement lots. It is knowing that there is an exhibit in the docket, Exhibit 47, that consists of a photograph of the USS Pasadena's change of command program from last September, because I had been trying to show Marissa why I was doing this at all. In the second summer, which was 2026, Marissa called me on a Thursday afternoon in October and said, "Randy, NCIS wants to meet." The Charleston Major Case Response Team. I said, "When?" She said, "Tomorrow, 6 in the morning, at the Waffle House on the I-26 eastbound exit for St. George. They want to meet before the breakfast rush." I said, "Okay." I drove out there that morning before it was light. I sat in a vinyl booth in the back. Two men walked in at 5:55. They were both in khakis. They both had the kind of haircut that does not quite look federal, but almost does. They introduced themselves. Special Agent Quentin Heckard, NCIS Major Case Response Team, Charleston Field Office, 18 years in service, prior Navy SEAL, served Iraq 2004. Special Agent Mona Pellegrin, Defense Criminal Investigative Service, Columbia Resident Agency. A third person came in about 10 minutes later. He was in a dark suit. He was younger. His name was Wyatt Lindeman. He was a trial attorney with the Department of Justice Civil Fraud Section out of Washington. He was assigned to the case by then. The three of them ordered coffee. I ordered coffee. I ordered eggs. They did not. Heckard did most of the talking. He asked me to walk through the story again. I did. I talked for an hour and a half. He asked good questions. Pellegrin asked about the Department of Labor side. I went into that in detail. Lindeman asked about the structure of the pricing matrix. I explained how I had built it. When I was done, Heckard said, "Chief, we are going to need the original notebooks. We are going to need the fireproof safe contents. We are going to need the external hard drive." I said, "When?" He said, "Today, if you can." I said, "I can." They drove to Somerville with me. They inventoried everything. They took the originals. They gave me a receipt. They left. After they left, I sat on the back porch for a long time. It was a warm morning. The sun was already high. I had given them everything. I do not mean that as drama. I mean it literally. The fireproof safe, the external hard drive, the original notebooks from the truck, the photographs, the manila envelope of uncashed checks, $8,200 worth, which I had mentioned to Marissa only in passing, and which Heckard and Pellegrin had taken as physical evidence of my non-participation in the incentive structure. I did not have anything left in my possession. The case was federal now. The case was theirs. I drove to work that afternoon. I sat at the mezzanine desk. I wrote a draft of the Veterans Outreach newsletter that Lex wanted to distribute for the upcoming anniversary of Veterans Day. I sent her the draft at 4:40. I left at 5:30. The next 5 months were the strangest stretch of my life, and I say that as a man who has stood hurricane watches on a destroyer in the Philippine Sea. The strangeness was the opposite of action. The strangeness was that I had handed a federal case to federal agents, and the federal case was now invisible. No call, no update, no paperwork. Marissa told me at the beginning that that was how it was supposed to work, because the case was sealed, and because any action on the federal side was going to happen on federal timelines that did not include me. She told me to act as if nothing had changed. She told me not to change my routines. She told me not to change my patterns at the office. She told me, and this is what stuck, that the most dangerous thing I could do was let Ed or Blake or Gil see me act as if I knew something they did not know. So I did not. I went to work. I wrote the newsletter. I attended the chamber breakfast. I said good morning to Claudette Seyfried. I said good morning to Gil Kresge. I said good morning to Blake. I did not say good morning to Ed because Ed had stopped coming to the site in the mornings by that point, which was a small thing I noticed and which I did not let myself think about. I walked the bays. I counted tables out of habit. I kept doing it for the whole 5 months, even after I had already given the notebooks to Heckard, because the count was now something I did for myself, the way an old man counts fence posts along a road he has walked 1,000 times. The number did not change. 340 tables, 48 welders, 1 sun, 1 ship. 5 more months passed. In March of 2026, 28 months and 12 days after the original filing, Marissa called me on a Tuesday morning at 6:50. She said, "Randy, they are going to execute the warrants tomorrow. Search the Goose Creek site, Ed's residence in Mount Pleasant, Blake's condo in Isle of Palms, Gil's workshop, the Alabama Shell LLC in Theodore." She said, "Do not go to work tomorrow." I said, "Okay." She said, DOJ is going to announce on Thursday. We can discuss press strategy after. I said, I am not doing press. She said, I figured. She said, Randy, the share is going to be 19% of the civil recovery, plus a separate allocation on the Department of Labor piece. Final numbers take a few weeks to settle, but you are looking at approximately $8.1 million gross on the civil side and a smaller allocation on the Department of Labor side. I said, Marissa, thank you for everything. She said, Randy, you did this. I did the paperwork. I did not go to work on Wednesday. I sat in the kitchen. I read the local paper at the table. I watched the weather. At around 10:30, I heard a helicopter pass over Somerville going north, which is not the direction helicopters usually go, and I knew that was probably one of the agencies moving somebody. I did not know which one. I did not turn on the television news all day. At 5:30 in the afternoon, Marissa called me. She said, they executed clean. Nobody was hurt. Ed was arrested on site at the Goose Creek facility at 10:15. Blake was arrested at the condo at 10:40. Gil was served at his workshop. Ed has a first appearance tomorrow morning. I said, what happens to the facility? She said, DCMA is already on site. The Level 3 corrective action plan will be issued by the end of the week. The Navy has paused deliveries on 3 submarine programs. The rework orders will be issued on affected lots. She paused. She said, Randy, the Navy is already identifying the affected holes. Do you want the hull numbers? I said, yes. She said, SSN 796, 798, 800. I said, those are not Eli's hull. She said, no, they are Virginia-class Block 5 boats, later deliveries. Eli's hull is Pasadena, SSN 752, a Los Angeles-class Flight 2 boat. That hull section is not in the affected lot set. I said, thank you, Marissa. She said, call me tomorrow. On Thursday morning, the Department of Justice announced the settlement. $42.6 million in civil recovery with the company and the 2 affiliated LLCs. $6.8 million in separate Department of Labor, Office of Inspector General recovery on the Workforce Development Grant. Ed Wexler indicted on conspiracy to defraud the United States under 18 United States Code, Section 371, and major fraud against the United States under 18 United States Code, Section 1031, subsequently pleaded guilty to both counts and received a 60-month sentence in federal custody, plus lifetime debarment from federal contracting. Blake Wexler, indicted on wire fraud under 18 United States Code, Section 1343, pleaded guilty, 30 months in federal custody. Gil Kresge surrendered his American Welding Society Certified Welding Inspector credential, entered into a deferred prosecution agreement, and was debarred from federal contracting for life. Vernell Broaddus and Gerald Okonkwo, the Alabama contract welders, pleaded to wire fraud and received 24 and 18-month sentences, respectively. The Defense Contract Management Agency issued the Level 3 Corrective Action Plan to the parent entity. The cognizant federal agency withdrew the company's CAGE code, which in defense contracting language means the company could no longer do business with any federal customer under its existing identity. The Navy issued rework orders on 3 affected submarine programs for hull section welds. The Department of Labor reassigned the Workforce Development Grant to a technical college in Orangeburg. The settlement was announced at 10 a.m. The relator named in the unsealed complaint was Randy Stanton, retired United States Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer. The Charleston Post and Courier picked it up at 10:40. The Wall Street Journal ran a short piece on Friday under their law section. Sea Power magazine did a long feature the following week. I did not speak to any reporter. Marissa handled press calls for me. She routed everything to a short written statement she and I had drafted together in advance. The statement said, Mr. Stanton is grateful for the thorough work of the Navy Criminal Investigative Service, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the Department of Labor Office of Inspector General, and the United States Department of Justice. He will not be giving interviews. The statement held. I went back to Somerville. I did not go to work. There was no work to go to. The The company existed on paper, but the operations were suspended pending DCMA disposition. Lex sent me an email on Monday morning saying my position had been terminated effective immediately and that my healthcare would continue through the end of the month. She did not say anything else. I did not reply. My son called me on Thursday night. He called from Pearl Harbor. The Pasadena was in refit. He said, "Dad." I said, "Eli." He said, "Is this you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The Post and Courier named you." I said, "I know." He said, "Was it my boat?" I said, "3 of your squadron's hulls, but not yours directly." Electric Boat re-welded the critical sections on the affected lots before the rework orders were even formal. They started rework within 72 hours of the settlement. I said, "Your boat is fine, son." He did not say anything for a long time. He said, "Dad, I have to go. I am on watch at 2200 local and I need to prep." I said, "Okay, son." He said, "Thank you." I said, "I love you, Eli." He said, "I love you too, Dad." He hung up. I want to say something about that phone call because I want to be honest about it. I did not cry. I did not come close to crying. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after we hung up, looking at the notebook I had started keeping on the 22nd of May, which now had almost a full year of entries in it. I sat there until it got dark and I did not turn on a light. I was 58 years old. I had one son. My father was dead. My mother was dead. My ex-wife was living in Virginia Beach with a good man named Rick, who sold commercial HVAC systems and took her to the Outer Banks every summer. I was alone in a kitchen in Summerville, South Carolina, with a notebook in front of me. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel anything that looked like victory. What I felt, as much as I could name it, was relief. Relief is a quiet thing. It is what is left when you have put down something heavy that you had been carrying for a long time without being entirely sure what the weight was. The Relator share payment cleared in late April of 2026. After legal fees, tax withholding, and the federal set-aside, the net number that came to me was $5.4 million. I left $1.5 million in a money market account because my father had taught me that a man keeps cash on hand, and because I did not know what I would need it for yet. I gave $500,000 to Commander Leverett's foundation at Charleston School of Law, which funds tuition waivers for service members transitioning to law school. I gave $200,000 to Dallas McKean, who was laid off when the company collapsed, and who has a 4-year-old boy named Sutton, whom she is raising alone. I wired the money without a note. She did not ask about it. She called me a week later and said, "Randy, is this you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." I said, "You saved it, Dallas. You saved the export." I gave $100,000 to Lloyd Enderly, who was also out of a job. He took it. He cried on the phone. I did not know what to say to him. He said, "Chief, my wife has stage 3. This is what we were praying for." I said, "Lloyd, I did not know." He said, "How would you know? I did not tell you." We hung up. I sat with it for a while. I took most of the rest of the money, which was around $1.9 million after the gifts, and I used it to open a nonprofit welder certification center in Chesapeake, Virginia. The center is called Anchor Light Welding. It provides free American Welding Society D 1.1 certification training and free NAVSEA 250-1-500-1 submarine structural welding training to service members within 12 months of separation from active duty. The first group enrolled 14 students, 8 of them Navy, 6 Marines, 2 women and 12 men, ages ranging from 23 to 47. The lead instructor is a retired Navy hull maintenance technician chief named Marisol Cardenas. She served 24 years. She welded hole patches on the USS Cole after the attack in 2000. She is exactly the kind of instructor who should be teaching that curriculum. I hired her in February. She wrote the curriculum with me over 6 long weekends. I do not teach classes. I do not give speeches. I open the building in the morning and I lock it at night. I keep the books. I write the checks. I sit in the office in the back, and I read the NAVSEA publications when I am not working on the books. On a Saturday in September of 2026, the USS Pasadena held a change of command ceremony at Naval Submarine Base, New London. Eli was promoted to Petty Officer First Class during the same ceremony, which is not how these things usually go, but the outgoing captain had requested it as a professional courtesy. I drove up to Connecticut on Friday. I wore a charcoal suit. I arrived at the ceremony 15 minutes early. I took a seat in the last row of folding chairs, which is what a parent who does not want to be seen does. Eli was at the front in service dress blues. He looked good. He looked very much like his grandfather did in the framed photograph above the stove in my mother's kitchen, which I had left up exactly where she had put it. The ceremony ran 45 minutes. Eli stood at attention. He did not see me. The outgoing captain saluted. The incoming captain returned the salute. The chaplain gave a short prayer. The assembled families applauded. Eli's mother was in the front row with Rick. I did not speak to her. After the ceremony, Eli was standing with his shipmates on the apron. I walked up. He saw me. He said, "Dad." He did not say, "You came." He did not say, "You are here." He said, "Dad." He shook my hand. He said, "Can you stay for lunch?" I said, "I can stay for 30 minutes." He said, "That is enough." We walked to a picnic area beyond the barracks. We sat on a bench. We did not talk about the case. We talked about the Pasadena's next deployment window. He told me about a new sonar operator who was working out well. He told me about a chief he was learning from. I told him Anchorlight had its first 2 graduates in August. Marisol had picked a man named Darnell Maynor, who had been a Marine Corps welder and who had done 4 hull patches on forward-deployed amphibious assault ships. Darnell had passed his D1.1 on the first attempt. Eli said, "Dad, that is good." I said, "Yeah, it is good." We stood up. He hugged me. I hugged him back. He said, "Dad, I am glad you came." I said, "Me too, son." He walked back to the ceremony area. I walked back to my car. I drove home to Somerville. I got in at 1 in the morning. I turned on the kitchen light. I stood at the counter. I made a peanut butter sandwich. I ate it. I turned off the light. I went to bed. There is one thing I still think about, and I want to say it because I would rather say it than not say it. I think about the first Tuesday in April of 2025, which was the day I sat with Dallas McKean and looked at the purchase order for the Miller Arc Station 40 table. I think about the look on her face when I asked her to pull 10 more lines. I think about the fact that she knew. I think about the fact that everyone on that floor knew, at some level, that the number on the purchase order was a different number than the number on the Navy budget line, and that the difference between those 2 numbers was a thing you could measure in submarines. I think about what it means for a group of 300 people to know a thing and not say it. I do not blame them. They had kids in school. They had mortgages. They had health insurance tied to Ed's company. I did too. That was the point. That was the design. The design was to price the overcharge at a scale large enough to fund 300 mortgages so that the 300 people would not look up. The thing I was told in the Navy, which I have thought about a lot since then, is that a ship is a composite body. It is held together not by the welds, but by the men who know how to weld. If the men know how to weld, the welds will be sound, and the ship will go down and come up. If the men do not know how to weld, the welds will fail, and the ship will not come up. The distinction is not about materials. The distinction is about the knowledge inside the men. A forged welder certification is not a piece of paper. It is a lie about what is inside a man. A 7 times overcharge on a welding table is not a financial crime. It is a statement that the men who will work on that table are interchangeable with the price of the table, and that the ship is interchangeable with the men, and that the sailors inside the ship are interchangeable with the ship. It is a philosophy, and the philosophy is wrong. The sailors are not interchangeable. My son is not interchangeable. I counted the invoices because I knew the sailors. I knew my son. And I knew my father, who welded on a GM line for 31 years and who would not have tolerated a single bad weld on a single body panel, let alone on a pressure hull that carried a human being 2,000 feet underwater. There is a bookshelf in the back office of the Anchor Light Welding Training Center in Chesapeake, Virginia. On the top shelf, there are 342 NAVC technical publications, the ones my mother bought at the government surplus auction in 2016. On the middle shelf, there is a framed photograph of my father in a GM tool shop in 1971, holding a set of calipers. On the bottom shelf, there is a manila envelope with $8,200 of uncashed performance incentive checks in it, which the federal government returned to me after the case closed because they were no longer needed as evidence. I did not cash them. I did not frame them. I put them on the shelf. I did not put them there as a trophy. I put them there because that is where they belong. They belong with the books. They belong with my father. They belong in the place where real work gets done by people who do not need to be paid off to do it. The count was 340. The count was 48. The count was 8.1 million. The count was one son. The count was one ship. The count was one father in a framed photograph. The thing about a count is that it only counts once, and then it is finished. I am Randy Stanton. I am 58 years old. I live in Summerville, South Carolina, in a ranch house my mother left me. I work every day at Anchor Light Welding in Chesapeake, Virginia, which is a 4-hour drive each way that I do twice a week. I open the building in the morning. I lock it at night. I do not give interviews. I do not speak to reporters. I do not appear at conferences. I keep the books. I read the NAVC publications. My son calls me from whatever port the Pasadena is in. I answer. I say, "Good." I say, "Good, son. I love you." He says he loves me too. He hangs up. I go back to the books. That is the story. That is what happened. That is what I did. The count is finished. The count was the thing that needed counting.